Alright, so we got a 2005 Honda Accord here. It's got about 270,000 miles on it or so. And this car has been in quite a few videos of mine. I've been working on it for a few years now. And she uses it as a delivery car. I guess her primary job is delivering. And she uses it for that. And it racks up the miles pretty quickly. And obviously, delivery jobs aren't that easy on components and stuff. I mean, it's a Honda, it runs good, but it does need maintenance. And at that many miles on it, things like this come up. So I put a upper ball joint on it a few months ago. And then last week I put a lower control arm on it because the bushings were shot. And now it needs a ball joint. And I'll show you how to test for a ball joint and what to look for. This one's making noise. And last week, we saw that it needed bushings real bad in the lower control arm, and it was making like a real loud squeaking noise. And I told her we need to fix that before we do anything else because you don't want your control arm moving around like that. And anyway, it was quiet for about a week, and then it started making another noise. Brought it in last night and found the ball joint on the lower side is wore out on it and in bad shape. So we're going to replace that today. Ideally, if this was your car, you were going to keep it for a long time, you would replace both lower ball joints at one time. She doesn't want to do that. Whether it's budget or she's told me before she wants to get a newer car soon. So I guess she's just trying to keep this one as safe as possible and spend as little money as possible. So I'm fine with that. The other side seems okay for now, but like I said, if this was your car, you're going to keep it long term. Maybe replace both of them at one time. So anyway, we'll go on the other side, and I'll show you how to replace a ball joint on this. These aren't real bad. You will need a press. If you don't have one, you can rent one at an auto parts store. But I'll go over that when we get to it. So first thing we'll do is I'll just show you what's going on with it and how to look for it, and then we'll start tearing it apart. Alright, so we're on the car here. Here's your lower ball joint right here. And what you're going to do is just watch that. I got the car up in the air. You don't have to get up as high as I have it right now, but I just got it set up to take the suspension apart right now. But what you want to do is get the tire and the wheel off the ground and get a big pry bar like this here and pry underneath the wheel. And you don't want any up and down movement on this ball joint. If it's moving up and down, you'll see the suspension stay kind of where it's at, but the ball joint itself will pop in and out. If you see that, then the ball joint is bad. So I'm going to kind of show you on the camera here. Just get underneath the tire with your pry bar. Hopefully that's showing up on the camera. You can see that suspension's popping up. Quite a bit of up and down movement on it. You don't want any movement at all on your ball joints like that. So that's why we're replacing it. It's making a noise and it is unsafe. If that ball joint would pop out, then obviously this wheel would fall off and bad things happen. I have seen that quite a bit. It seems like Honda especially, when the ball joints go, the wheels like to go off with them. So anyway, we're going to pull this wheel off and start taking this apart. And we'll go through that process. Alright, so the first thing we're going to concentrate is getting these brakes off. We're going to get them out of the way because I'm just going to go ahead and pull this whole spindle off. Sometimes you can do that. You can do these ball joints without doing that. But it's a big, on these it's kind of a pain and I don't want to, I'm just going to pull it off. So you got two 12mm bolts to hold this caliper on. We'll go ahead and zip those off first. And what we want to do on this, we don't want to just hang this down on the hose. That puts a lot of pressure on the hose. What we want to do is actually, I'm going to go ahead and pull off this 12mm bolt for the hose just to get it out so we have more room to play with. Plus, if we remove this, we got to take this off anyway. So it's, regardless, it's coming off. So anyway, what we're going to do now is just move this caliper out of the way, and what I'm going to do is just put a hook on it. You can get these. Sorry about that. You can get these at the auto parts store, or you got a bungee cord, whatever you have. Just don't hang the caliper off by the hose. It's hard on the hose. You don't want to have to spend more money for a hose. So we're just going to hang it off of the spring here on the strut. That's out of the way. That's safe. Now we're going to pull this back. Should be 17 usually on these Hondas, because we're going to pull the rotor and everything off. So I'm going to pull this caliper bracket off. That's 17 millimeter. There's 2 bolts in the back, and we're going to pull it off. So this just slides right off. Got 2 17 millimeter bolts behind it to hold it in, and we'll just go ahead and put the bolts right back in there, turn or 2, and set it off to the side. Now, if you're lucky, your rotor will slide off. Okay, if these screws are still in here, get yourself a impact screwdriver and knock these loose. A lot of times these won't come loose with just a regular screwdriver. You have to actually impact these to come loose. It makes it a lot easier. So I'll go ahead and get my impactor, and we'll take these out. And then there's these 2 holes here that you may have to put bolts into to run down in there, and then it pulls the rotor off. Sometimes they come off without that. We'll see. But first thing we do is get the impact screwdriver, and we'll take these two screws out. So this is what an impact screwdriver looks like. And all it is basically what the name applies. You put it in there and you strike this end of it with a hammer, and that shocks it loose. Normally only takes a few good solid hits. Now I have seen some where these screws will rust in there, and you can't, the head will be messed up and you can't get them out. It's not a big deal. You can drill these out if you have to. I have had that happen before where I had to drill them out. And like I said, it's not the end of the world if you have to do that. These are set in there from the factory to go down the assembly line, and all it does is hold the rotor in there. You don't technically need these. I always put them back just because I'm kind of OCD like that. If it came out of there, I put it back. But you technically don't need those in there. Once the wheel is on, it holds the rotor just like most cars. You find a lot of these screws on the Hondas and stuff, sometimes Toyotas, and it's not 100% necessary to put them back. I always do. I know people get on to me about that on YouTube comments. Why do you put those back in there? For me, if it came out, I'm putting it back. But I also understand. I also understand that. Sorry about that. I'm going to take him inside. So I also understand that. You know, they're not necessarily needed, but I just put them back. So anyway, I'm going to pull this rotor off. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out this cotter pin here for the upper ball joint. And we're going to take it out because we're going to loosen this upper ball joint out. I'm actually probably getting ahead of myself. I probably need to loosen. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this axle next. I'll go ahead and take the bolt out of the ball joint. Those are usually 17. This one looks a little smaller. Maybe it is. Okay. Yeah, it's 17. I might need to get a shallow. I'm going to grab a shallow, and then we're going to pull this axle nut out too. Because once this ball joint comes out, it's going to pull this forward. We don't want to pull the axle apart at the CV. So the next thing we'll do is take this nut off on the axle down below, and then we'll knock this ball joint out. Alright, so I'm going to take this axle nut off. It's 32 millimeter. I'm not sure if my Milwaukee stubby will get it off. It usually does, but you never know on these axle nuts. Alright, so I did get it off. 32 mil. And just kind of push in on this axle a little bit, which I did. and make sure that you don't, when you pull this upper ball joint out, you don't want to pull your CV axle out. You want this to be free and able to move so it doesn't pull out. And we're going to pull this whole thing off anyway, so it has to come off either way, but just go ahead and do that before you knock off the top ball joint. So I'm going to go back up to that, and then we'll move on from there. Alright, so we're just taking this 17mm nut off. I already broke it loose, and it's off. And you don't need power tools to do this. You can use, I use this Milwaukee stubby. It's awesome for suspension work and stuff like that, but it's not 100% needed. You can use good old-fashioned tools. It is easier to take ball joint nuts off with an impact just because they have a tendency to spin. We're going to try to just hit it right here a couple times to see if it'll come loose. I do have a ball joint separator that we'll probably end up using on the bottom. But if you don't have that, normally you could just hit them right here on the steering knuckle, a couple good hits, and it should pop it loose. There we go. So this is your ABS or your line here, and we're going to take this off. I believe that's a 10. Let me double check. We're going to need to get this out completely. I tell you it's a 10, I grab a 12. So we're going to need to get this one off completely because we're going to pull this whole knuckle off. Now it's everything's kind of loose. And like I said before, just make sure your axle is free, which this one did move in quite a bit. I don't want to beat on it real hard. You don't want to distort your axle, but anyway, this is free. We're going to go ahead and take off the tie rod and the end of this ABS sensor. Hopefully it'll come off. A lot of times those can seize up and rust up in there. We don't want that to happen, but we'll see what we can do with it before we get too worried about it. Alright, so just follow your ABS line down to the sensor. It's behind this dust shield here. It's 10mm, it holds the nut in. We're going to go ahead and break that loose, take it off. And like I said before, we're going to hope that this thing's not rusted on there. We're going to try to work it back and forth. This one's actually moving pretty well. So I think this one will come off without too much persuasion. Sometimes but you don't want to break it off in there. And then you're looking at a $70 or $80 sensor. You don't want to pull up too hard on the wires. Just work it back and forth. This one's coming out. I'm just using my hand, I'm working it back and forth. Sometimes you gotta use a screwdriver or something. So here it is. It's a little bit rusty, but we'll clean it up a little bit and just set it off for the side right now. I'm just gonna wrap it up around the upper control arm and kind of hang it off to the side. So the only two things holding this on now is the lower ball joint and the tie rod. So I'm gonna go ahead and take those two loose, and then we'll pull this off, and then we should be able to put this on the bench and get this ball joint out. So I'll get you under there, and I believe they're both 17mm. Take the cotter pins out. I'm going to go ahead and pull the cotter pins out, and then we'll take them off and go from there. Alright, so I got the cotter pin out. We're just going to pull out the 17mm nut. And then we're going to do the same thing we did on the upper ball joint. We're just going to tap it right here with the sledge. You don't have to go crazy on it. Just tap it, kind of shock it. Should pop out like that. Sometimes they won't if they're really seized in there, especially a ball joint. And then you have to get a ball joint remover or go nuts with a pickle fork or something like that. We try to avoid that. We don't want to damage. Like I said, she doesn't want to replace anything anyway. We don't want to damage anything. So this is how we do it. We just tap on this a couple times. It should pop out. If all is right in the world, sometimes it's not. But so now all we got is the lower ball joint is holding this in, this whole unit in here, and then we're good to go. Quite a bit of rust right here. sure these are original wheel bearings, but who knows. So we're going to get underneath there, remove that nut on the ball joint, and then we may have to separate that with a separator, and then we'll take this over to the bench and start taking the ball joint out. Alright, so we're under here. We're just going to remove this cotter pin real quick. And get this nut out. Hopefully this should come out pretty easy. I just put a lower ball or lower control arm on this, and had it off recently, so it should come out pretty easily. Ball joints are kind of a wild card when it comes to coming out or not coming out. So what I'm going to use here is a ball joint separator and push it up and out. And we're just going to set it on there like that. Like I said, you can get these from, you can rent them from auto parts store. I believe you can. I got this as a set, a front end set, OTC. Now if we're going to reuse this ball joint, I usually put the nut back on there so I don't mushroom out the ball joint. Since we're not reusing the ball joint, I'm just going to go ahead and run it through. Just like that. And now this whole assembly should pull out in a way. Just be careful not to pull too hard on your axle. You don't want to pull your CV apart, and that can happen if you pull on it too hard. But once we get the ball joint out, that was the last thing holding this in. And be able to lift up on it here and pull it away from everything. And like I said, I'm going to be very careful with this CV. Just lightly tapping it. It's pretty rusty in here. So I'm going to go get a drift real quick and push the CV out the rest of the way, because I really don't want to pull this thing apart on accident. So I just got a small drift, and I'm just hammering on that to pull it out. So I got it out. We'll go over to the bench now and start removing this ball joint on here. Alright, once you get it on your bench or whatever, the first thing you want to do is take this little shield off. This is what kind of shields the wheel bearing here. And I like to go in at this gap right here where your speed sensor's at, and that's usually where I start. And I just kind of put a small punch in there and just kind of hammer down on it. And that usually gets it started, gets it loose, and then you can go from there on it. Turn it this way. These are a little bit annoying. You don't want to, you're trying to damage them. Like I said, usually these pop right out. Yeah, it popped out. So, sorry about that. This is what you're trying to get out, is this ring, and it doesn't look like it's damaged at all. So that's good. If you would have the damage, they do sell them, but hopefully you don't. And the reason why you take that out is to get to this ball joint here. Now on these Hondas, a few different ways you can do this. If you don't have a press, you're going to need a press no matter what to put it back in. But to take them out, you don't necessarily need a press. And the reason I say that is it's because it's very hard, even with the press, to find something to fit in here to hook the press up to, because you're going to drive it out this way. So the press has to go into this very narrow spot right here, and you have to find something that will allow you to drive it out. I can't remember I know usually I cut these off. I'll cut them off right here and put the press directly on it, or you can beat them out with a hammer. So I'm going to look and see. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I know I usually cut these off right here with a grinder, the actual stud, because when you try to press on this, it has a tendency to want to move around like this, you know. So it's easier on these Hondas for me, I've found, just to cut this off with the cutoff wheel, and then press on the bottom here. Let me see if I can find something. I can't remember what I do with this here. I have to find something that fits around this. It's a real tight fit on these Hondas. So let me look and see what I got, and I'll show you what I end up doing. Either I will either end up cutting this off and beating it out, or cutting it off and pressing it out. So we'll see which way we go with this one. Alright, now I kind of remember the deal on these. There's a half cup that goes in here. It's basically like a big, a regular ball joint adapter, but it's cut with a notch out so it fits in here correctly. I currently don't have one of those, so what I normally do on these is beat them out. I think the CRVs and the Elements are a little bit different. You can get something in here. I can't remember, but I do remember now on these Accords, and I think the Civics, they have little half cup adapters, and I don't have that adapter. I got a master kit, and that doesn't come with that. So we'll go to step number 2, which is we're going to cut this off here, and then we're just going to beat it out. It usually doesn't take a whole lot of pressure to beat it out. So I'm just going to go ahead and use a cutoff wheel and cut that off, and then I'll pick it back up. Alright, so usually I put a pad under there to keep the lugs halfway protected. I've already beat on this probably 4 or 5 times. It's already almost out. And you're just going to beat on it, and it should slide right out after a couple hits. There you go. You can see there, it doesn't take a whole lot. I did hit it about 3 or 4 times before that, but that's the ball joint out. Alright, they do install the boot from the factory when they give you these ball joints. And the problem with that is this boot is wider than the ball joint itself. So when you try to press it in there, you'll screw it up. So you got to take that little annoying spring clip they have on there, take it off, and slide the boot off. That way you're not screwing the boot up. It is possible to get it back in once you get the ball joint pressed in. So when you put the ball joint back in, you're going to want to use a press for that. You're going to slide it in there. Make sure it's as straight as possible. And get yourself a cup that will go over that hole that's wider than the hole, because you don't want to be pressing on this cup when you're bringing the ball joint in. So this one's wider than the hole, and then we're going to get the ball joint press. And you know, beating it out is not super professional, but it's funny because the last 3 or 4 times I've done ball joints on Accords, I said I got to get that adapter kit, and I always forget to order it. And then I'm beating it back out, and it's really not that big of a deal because you do need a regular press to put it in, but to take them out, it's really not. Beating it out is not the worst thing in the world. I do need to order it, but whatever reason I always forget. So you want to set it up and have this as straight as possible because you want this to go down straight. I'm going to go find the socket I need, and I'll be right back. Alright, so we're just going to roll this in, and like I said, just make sure it's straight. Double check it a few times. I've already got started a little bit, and it looks straight, so I'm going to go ahead and take it in the rest of the way. You don't have to rush this either. You can go a little bit slow with it, and just make sure that if you're off a hair, it'll usually straighten itself out, but you don't want to go in real cattywampus on it because you can screw up the ball joint and the spindle itself. Socket came off and back on. this here. And right there, it's bottomed out, so it's in there and it's straight. And it's ready to roll. So you can see they come out and go in pretty easy. It's not super hard. It does help to have that special tool. I don't even think the auto parts stores rent those out for the Hondas. I'm not sure, but I think I asked one time, they did not rent them out. So it's nice and flush all the way around. It's pressed in, so we're going to go ahead and put this back on. And you just got this little kind of ridiculous spring thing here, and it just goes on. You got to work it back on, and then we'll put this little shield back on, and then we're ready to start putting it back on the car. Alright, if you're like me, then you spend entirely too much time putting that dust shield back on their boot. This ring, it always hassles you. It has like almost like three layers to it. And what I usually do is get a small pick and get under the first one and kind of run it around. You got to be careful. You don't want to puncture a hole in this boot, and then you have your grease will escape eventually. But if you work it around, it takes, 5 or 10 minutes, it seems like, to get this back on. It's kind of a pain. I don't know why they create it like this. There should be a better way, but it is possible. And if you try to put the ball joint in with this boot on, you're probably going to rip the boot. So it's better just take it off and then just take your time putting that ring back on. Now with this seal that I put back in, I just use one of my ball joint front wheel adapter kits, and it fits perfectly in the middle of that. I just beat on this instead of the seal. If you don't have something like this big enough, you can just kind of lightly tap it in there, but you do risk damaging it, so try to be careful. The best bet is to find something that fits inside of it that'll grab it and just tap that down. So now this is ready to go back on the car. This particular ball joint, you could put a little more grease in there if you had one of the needle fittings for your grease gun. Just kind of get it under there and shoot some more grease in if you want. But now it's ready to go back on the car, so we'll go over there and start putting this back together. Alright, we're going to set this back in there. And what I'm going to do is start with the axle first, and then I'll lift it off and lower the ball joint into the lower part, and then flip the upper part up. So you want to get your axle at least kind of started in there. Make sure it's locked in. And then I got the lower already in the lower control arm there, so it's kind of lined up. And then axle's being a little bit stubborn. There it goes. Guys are a little bit stubborn. And I'm going to put the upper control arm and the upper ball joint. I'm just going to start it for now. So right now it's through the lower control arm. The new ball joint's through the lower control arm. We got the upper ball joint going through the spindle, so it's not going nowhere, and the axle's all the way through. You want to make sure your axle's through before you start tightening anything up, because sometimes the axles can come apart a little bit. And there's enough play in them where they can kind of unlock from each other on the inside of the CV, and then you'll have a hard time looking for the new bolt or the new nut. There we are. I was just looking for the new nut for the ball joint, lower ball joint. Anyway, if the axle is apart a little bit, it's real hard to get it back together if you got everything tight. So go ahead and make sure that is in there and that it's sticking out of here quite a bit and that it's not bound up in any way. So we're just going to go through, start tightening everything. I'll go ahead and do the upper ball joint first. That's 17 mil. I'll have to go get my tool. If you have new cotter pins, it's always a good idea to reuse those, which I do have, so I'm probably going to go get some out of my drawer real quick. And you just tighten it and line it up with your cotter pin hole. That one's 17, so we'll put a cotter in that. Yeah, there's no problem. You can put your tie rod in now if you want. That one was a little bit of a weird nut. So I'm going to go collect some cotter pins and find all my little nuts that I have laying around. Car nuts laying around. And we'll come right back. Alright, I went ahead and tightened up the lower ball joint, the tie rod, and the upper ball joint. I'll give you the specs to it if you want those at the end of the video. I'll put a little list there. Put all the cotter pins in. Now we're just down to, oh, and I started this axle nut and kind of snugged it up. I'll give you the torque spec on that too. With the axle nut, if you're by yourself, there's a few ways you can do it. You can put the wheel back on, put the car down, leave the hubcap off, and tighten it. If you have a wheel that you're not able to do that with, you can put a pry bar through here and kind of hold. This will kind of hold it, and you can turn it, or you can have someone hold the brakes once you get the brakes back on, do the final torque on it. With this being in park, you could probably just do it like it is here with the torque. Actually, I don't know what I was thinking, but anyway, we're going to go ahead and put that speed sensor back in. And the thing I didn't mention about the speed sensor also is, or the ABS sensor, is if yours is seized up down here, you don't want to buy a new sensor, you can follow it up into the wheel well here, and it goes out into the engine compartment, and you could unhook it from there, but you know, sometimes they will get rusted and seized in here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it down. I got to get it fished out. It's stuck underneath there. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down, and then we'll hook that back up. And that's why it's so important to line that dust shield up properly when you put it back on, because if you don't put that slot where it's supposed to go, your speed sensor here, your ABS sensor will not go down where it's supposed to go. So you definitely want to pay attention to that shield that you took off. You got two 10mm bolts on this. Make sure your speed sensor is seated before you tighten it. You don't want it in there crooked or something, you can crack it. And then we got that 10mm up here that holds the line, and then all we have left is the brakes. So we're almost done. And like I said, if you don't have the right tools, take the ball joint out. You can beat it out like I did. It's not, you know, it's not the greatest method, but it does work. And as long as you're careful, you don't mar up your knuckle here, you're fine with it. Like I said, I've been doing it for quite a while. I keep meaning to order the parts and or ordering the adapter kit. I already have 2 or 3 different adapter kits for my ball joint press, and for whatever reason I keep forgetting to get the Honda one. So we're going to line the rotor up, and I'm going to put those bolts, I know that drives some people nuts, but I am going to put those screws back in and tighten them up a little bit. So I always like to put the car back the way I found it, and these screws were in it when I found it. Like I said, I know they're not necessary, and the only time I won't put these back in is if they're rusted or something, or the head is messed up and I got to drill them out. You know, I won't spend time drilling out the hub to make sure, and then possibly retapping the hole. I won't do that, but if at all possible, I usually put it back in. So I got it back on. I'm going to turn the wheel the other way, and we'll put the caliper bracket and caliper back on, and this thing's ready to boot out. Alright, so I got the caliper bracket back on. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down. And then we can unhook our caliper from the hanger here. Hopefully. Just leave it hanging by the hose. Slide that back on. Now's a good time to check your brakes. Her brakes look pretty decent. So you got your two 12mm bolts, and then you're good to go. You put your wheel back on, and got a new ball joint on your Honda Accord. I will leave the torque specs to the different items. I'm seeing a power steering leak, so I'm going to have to check that out. But I'll leave the torque specs for the different suspension parts that we took off, so that you have that if you're so inclined to torque everything down to perfect spec. The axle nut would be a good one to do. I always torque those down to the right spec once I'm done with the job. The ball joints, stuff like that, we just do them snug. But I will get the specs for you if you want to use them. So that's pretty much it on the Honda Accord with the lower. Now the upper ball joint, you usually just replace the arm with it, and they're pretty reasonable. You do have to drop the strut out a little bit. It's a little bit, they're both about the same time-wise, I guess. Maybe the lower ball joint takes a little bit longer, a little bit more involved, but you know, they're not super hard. You will need a ball joint press to put it back in. I wouldn't recommend beating it back in. Definitely wouldn't do that. And the auto parts stores will rent you the ball joint press if you don't have one. So regardless, you're going to need that, and then it's up to you if you wanted to buy that adapter or try to find it. Maybe your auto parts store carries it. Ours doesn't around here, and that's probably the main reason why I never bought one. Usually if I rent a tool, I'll just keep it. And I think I asked before, nobody had it a long time ago. Maybe it's changed since then, but I'll probably go on the old interwebs and order one up if I can remember tonight, so that I have it for the next job. But like I said, it's not 100% necessary. Oh, I do have this bolt here for the line. I'm glad I caught that. It's not 100% necessary though, because you can beat it out, and it's not that big of a deal. So anyway, that's it for Honda Accord lower ball joint. You know, just looking this thing over with this many miles of stuff, it does need, looks like the wheel bearings are getting pretty rusty and worn. I'm sure that those have never been changed. So I'm going to mention it to her, but I got a feeling she's going to wait until, she's been saying for about a year she's going to get a different car. So we'll see if she actually does. The problem with these Hondas, they run forever. So people say they might want another car, it's hard to let them go because they keep running. So anyway, thanks for watching. As always, God bless.